The National Hockey League loves to sell you its history, the legends, the dynasties, the black and white glory. But behind the iconic photos and the grainy footage lies a darker story, a history of greed, control, and controversy hidden in plain sight. This is every NHL era controversy explained. The original Six era is often remembered as the golden age of hockey, a time of pure, tough, rivalry-driven sport played by Iron Men for 6 legendary franchises. It was the era of Gordie Howe, Rocket Richard, and Bobby Hull. But for the players, it was an era of oppression. The golden age was golden for the owners, not the athletes. The entire system was built on a foundation of absolute control, a system that treated players not as partners, but as property. The source of this power was a simple piece of paper, the standard player's contract, also known as the Form C. Buried in the fine print was the reverse clause, a contractual tool that effectively bound a player to their team for life. Once a player signed their first contract, they belonged to that club forever. They had no freedom. They could not negotiate with other teams. They could not refuse a trade. They could not test their value on an open market because a free market didn't exist. Their only options were to play for the team that owned them, for whatever salary the team offered, or to quit hockey entirely. It wasn't a partnership. It was a form of indentured servitude. This immense power was concentrated in the hands of a very small group of wealthy owners, and no one held more power than the Norris family. James D. Norris owned the Detroit Red Wings, but his influence spread much further. His family held huge, often hidden financial stakes in the Chicago Blackhawks and the New York Rangers. Beyond that, they physically owned the arenas in all 3 of those cities, as well as the Boston Garden. This created a staggering conflict of interest that bordered on a monopoly. For nearly 15 years, the Norris-controlled teams operated like a private club, making a series of lopsided, collusive trades among themselves to consolidate talent and power, while often working together to weaken the 2 independent teams, the Montreal Canadiens and the Toronto Maple Leafs. The league wasn't a balanced competition. It was a fixed game, and the Norris family owned the casino. When players tried to fight back, they were crushed. In the 1950s, Red Wing superstar Ted Lindsay, one of the toughest and most respected players in the game, led an effort to form a real players' association to fight for basic rights and a fair pension. The owners, terrified of losing their absolute power, made an example of him. Lindsay was publicly vilified, stripped of his captaincy, and in an ultimate act of punishment, traded from the powerhouse Red Wings to the pathetic last-place Chicago Blackhawks. The message to every other player was clear: step out of line and your career will be ruined. The most cynical controversy of all was the pension plan itself. After years of resistance, the owners finally agreed to a pension in 1947, funded in part by revenue from playoff games. But decades later, through investigations into the Allen Eagleson scandal, the truth came out. It was discovered that throughout the original Six era, the owners had been systematically underfunding the pension, skimming money that was owed to the players and diverting it into their own pockets. They weren't just exploiting the players during their careers, they were stealing from their futures too. The original Six was a legendary era of hockey, but the on-ice glory was built on a foundation of office exploitation, a controversy that kept players powerless for a generation. The original Six era finally ended in 1967, with the league doubling in size. It was supposed to usher in a new age of opportunity and growth. Instead, it unleashed a monster. The new controversy wasn't about contracts signed in a boardroom. It was about a violent philosophy executed on the ice, a strategy of pure intimidation that would drag the entire league into a debate over the soul of the sport. When the NHL expanded from 6 to 12 teams in 1967, it created a massive dilution of talent. One of the new teams, the Philadelphia Flyers, learned a hard lesson in their first playoff series. They were physically dominated, bullied, and humiliated by the St. Louis Blues. That embarrassment became the franchise's origin story, leading to the team's management to a fateful and controversial decision. They would never be pushed around again. If they couldn't outskill the league, they would beat it into submission. This was the birth of the Broad Street Bullies. The Flyers front office began to deliberately build not just a hockey team, but the most intimidating gang in professional sports. They drafted and acquired a collection of enforcers whose primary job was to inflict pain. Players like Dave the Hammer Schultz, whose fists were more famous than his stick handling, Bob Hound Kelly, Andre Moose DuPont, and Don Big Bird Selesky. Their names became legendary, not for scoring goals, but for starting brawls. The bully strategy was revolutionary in its brutality. It was a calculated plan to terrorize opponents. They would start fights in warm-ups. They would instigate line brawls seconds after the opening faceoff, as they famously did against the Atlanta Flames in a 1974 playoff game. Their goal was to create an atmosphere of pure fear, to intimidate skilled players so thoroughly that they would be too scared to play their game. And it worked. Dave Schultz became the poster child for this philosophy. In the 1974-75 season, he shattered the NHL record for penalty minutes, accumulating an astonishing 472 minutes in a single season. To put that into perspective, that's the equivalent of spending nearly 8 full 60-minute games in the penalty box. It's a record that still stands today and will likely never be broken. The controversy reached a global stage in 1976 during the Super Series between NHL teams and the legendary Soviet Red Army team. The Soviets were a dynasty, a team that dominated the world with breathtaking skill and precision. They had never played a team like the Flyers. Early in the game, a Flyers defenseman delivered a brutal, unpenalized body check that left one of the Soviet Union star players, Valery Kharlamov, flattened on the ice. In a stunning act of protest against the violence, the Soviet coach pulled his entire team off the ice, refusing to continue. The game only resumed after the NHL threatened to withhold the Soviets team's pay for the entire exhibition tour. The message was clear. The Bullies brand of hockey was so far outside the bounds of international sportsmanship that the best team in the world refused to participate. The success of the Broad Street Bullies created a crisis for the NHL. They won back-to-back Stanley Cups in 1974 and 1975, seemingly validating their violent methods. But their championship wins sparked a furious debate that divided the hockey world. Critics, especially in the media and in more traditional Canadian markets, were horrified. They argued that the Flyers had ruined hockey, replacing the art of the sport with cheap thuggery. They claimed the Bullies' success was inspiring a new generation of teams to employ goon tactics, dragging the entire league into the gutter. Proponents, however, argued that the Flyers were simply playing tough hockey and exploiting a rulebook that was too weak to stop them. But there was no denying their impact. The Broad Street Bullies forced the NHL to confront the level of violence it was willing to accept. They were a championship team that played with a level of intimidation so controversial it changed the league forever. But the league's biggest controversies weren't always so visible. While the Bullies were committing assault in plain sight, the biggest crime in hockey history was happening silently, in boardrooms and back offices, orchestrated by the most powerful man in the sport. The 1980s were the era of Wayne Gretzky and Mario Lemieux, a time of incredible offensive explosions and legendary dynasties. But behind the on-ice magic, a massive rot was festering at the heart of the league. It was a scandal of greed, corruption, and betrayal, masterminded by one man, Alan Eagleson. For decades, Eagleson was the undisputed king of the hockey world. He was a player agent, the executive director of the National Hockey League's Players Association, and the organizer of the prestigious Canada Cup international tournaments. To the players, he was Uncle Al, the tough-as-nails lawyer they trusted to fight the greedy owners on their behalf. In reality, he was the fox guarding the henhouse, and he was secretly robbing them blind. His power was absolute, and his conflicts of interest were staggering. As the head of the NHLPA, his job was to get the best possible deal for the players. But as a player agent, his job was to get the best deal for his clients. And as a tournament organizer, he was in the business with the very owners he was supposed to be fighting. Eagleson used this web of influence not to help the players, but to build his own personal empire, creating a decades-long controversy that remains the single greatest fraud in the history of professional sports. The crimes were as brazen as they were numerous. Eagleson had complete control over the finances of the Canada Cup tournaments, events made possible by the participation of the world's best players. He skimmed millions of dollars from the revenues, hiding profits in secret bank accounts and diverting the money that should have gone to the players' pension funds into his own pockets to fund a lavish lifestyle of fancy suits, expensive travel, and luxury apartments. Perhaps the most despicably, he stole from the most vulnerable. Eagleson controlled the players' disability insurance program. When a player suffered a career-ending injury, it was Eagleson they went to for help. But instead of being a compassionate advocate, he was a predator. He would routinely deny or delay legitimate claims, and in some cases, he pocketed the insurance payments that were meant for his injured and desperate clients, men whose careers and livelihoods had been destroyed. While he publicly postured as the players' champion, he was privately colluding with the owners. He worked with them behind the scenes to suppress player salaries and maintain the league's exploitative contract system, all while taking kickbacks and sweetheart deals for himself. He even failed to investigate the historical underfunding of the players' pension plan from the original Six era, because he was now part of the problem. For years, no one dared to question him, but eventually a few courageous players began to speak out. The movement was led by none other than Boston Bruins legend Bobby Orr, whose own finances had been left in the ruins by Eagleson's mismanagement and deceit. Orr, along with other retired players, began to uncover the truth. Their efforts, combined with the work of investigative reporters and a multi-year investigation by the FBI, slowly began to unravel Eagleson's criminal enterprise. The downfall was as stunning as his rise to power. After years of defiant denials, the evidence became overwhelming. In 1998, Alan Eagleson pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement in both the United States and Canada. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison for his crimes. In the ultimate act of disgrace, he was forced to resign from the Hockey Hall of Fame and remains the only member in its history to be kicked out. The Allen Eagleson scandal was more than just a financial crime. It was a profound betrayal that shattered the trust of a generation of hockey players. It exposed a dark underbelly of the league's business dealings and forced a complete overhaul of the NHLPA. The modern, more adversarial relationship between players and owners, and the labor wars that would define the next 2 decades, were all born from the ashes of Eagleson's deceit. It is the defining off-ice controversy in NHL history. The league survived the Eagleson scandal, but the controversies kept coming. The next one wouldn't be about stolen money, but a stolen goal. A single moment that decided a championship and was so infuriating, the league was forced to rewrite its own rulebook. The late 1990s were known as the dead puck era for a reason. Offense was grinding to a halt, suffocated by the defensive strategy known as the neutral zone trap. Goals were rare and precious commodities. This defensive reality set the stage for one of the most intense and controversial moments in Stanley Cup final history, where a championship was decided by a single play and an infuriating, confusing rule. The rule in question was the infamous skate in the crease rule. It was a rule born from good intentions, to protect goaltenders from being interfered with, but its application was absolute and unforgiving. The rule stated that if any part of the attacking player's skate was inside the blue paint of the goal crease before the puck crossed the line, the goal would be disallowed. It didn't matter if the player touched the goalie. It didn't matter if their skate was a millimeter over the line for a split second. If the skate was in, the goal was off. All season long, goals have been called back for the slightest infraction, leaving players, coaches, and fans enraged. This brings us to Game 6 of the 1999 Stanley Cup Final between the Dallas Stars and the Buffalo Sabres. The game was a grueling defensive battle, a perfect showcase of the era. It went into third overtime period with the Stanley Cup on the line. The next goal would win everything. Late in the period, Dallas Stars forward Brett Hull got control of a rebound in front of the Sabres' net. With his skate in the crease, he kicked the puck to his stick and fired it past a sprawling Dominik Hasek. The red light went on. The Dallas Stars poured onto the ice celebrating a championship victory. But everyone in the building, especially the entire Buffalo Sabres team, saw the replay on the Jumbotron, and it was undeniable. Hull's left skate was clearly inside the crease before the puck went in. According to the rule that had been strictly enforced all year, it was an illegal play. It was a no-goal. The Sabres were certain the game would be reset. After a tense review, the stunning verdict came down. The goal stood. The Dallas Stars were officially Stanley Cup champions. The city of Buffalo was in shock and disbelief. The league's explanation was baffling. They claimed that an unwritten loophole in the rule allowed the goal because Hull had maintained possession and control of the puck throughout the play. It was an interpretation that no one, not even the broadcasters calling the game, had ever heard of. It felt like the league was making up a rule on the spot to justify a championship-winning goal. The outrage in Buffalo was immense. To this day, the moment is simply known as no goal. It is seen as one of the most blatant and infuriating officiating decisions in sports history. The controversy was so damaging and the league's explanation so weak that they were left with only one choice. Before the start of the very next season, the NHL completely abolished the skate in the crease rule, a tacit admission that they had gotten it wrong on the biggest stage imaginable. The modern era has had its share of lockouts and salary cap disputes, but no controversy has been more serious or more morally significant than the scandal that rocked the Chicago Blackhawks and exposed a dark culture of silence at the very top of the sport. The story began during the team's historic run to the Stanley Cup in 2010. While the team was marching towards a championship on the ice, a horrific crime was taking place behind the scenes. A young player on the team, later bravely identified as Kyle Beach, reported to team management that he had been sexually assaulted and harassed by the team's video coach, Brad Aldrich. This was the moment that the organization had a choice. They could do the right thing, report the crime to the police and immediately remove the accused coach from the team. Or they could do the easy thing, stay quiet and focus on winning. They chose to stay quiet. A now infamous meeting was held with a group of senior Blackhawks leaders, including team president John McDonough, general manager Stan Bowman, and head coach Joe Quenneville. According to an independent investigation conducted years later, they made the explicit decision to take no action on Beach's allegations until after the playoffs were over. They prioritized winning a trophy over protecting their own player from a predator. The consequences of their inaction were devastating. Brad Aldrich was allowed to remain with the team. He traveled with them. He worked with them. And he was present at the parties and parades celebrating their Stanley Cup victory. He was even seen celebrating with the cup itself. During that time, he made an unwanted sexual advance on a 22-year-old team intern. After the season, he was quietly allowed to resign, given a severance package, a playoff bonus, and a championship ring. For over a decade, the story was buried. But in 2021, after a lawsuit was filed, the independent Jenner and Block report was released. It was a scathing document that detailed the assault and the subsequent cover-up in undeniable detail. The report was a bombshell that sent a shockwave across the entire sports world. The fallout was massive. Stan Bowman resigned from the Blackhawks in disgrace. Joel Quenneville, who had gone on to coach the Florida Panthers, was also forced to resign. The Blackhawks were fined $2 million by the league for their inadequate procedures and mishandling. But the real impact went much deeper. The Kyle Beach story exposed a toxic culture of silence that had long existed in hockey, where the pressure to win often outweighed the moral obligation to do what is right. It forced a league-wide reckoning on player safety, accountability, and the duty that teams have to protect their people. It was a watershed moment in NHL history, a brutal and necessary controversy that proved that the darkest secrets can't stay buried forever. From working under challenging conditions to scoring winning goals, from financial fraud to unforgivable moral failures, the history of the NHL is filled with more than just legendary players and iconic moments. It's a story of power, greed, and the controversies that shape the game forever. So what's the biggest controversy the league is facing today? Let us know in the comments.